All right, I'm Greg. I do kernel stuff. Please interrupt, heckle. This is going to be more fun that way. I guess the box is charging, but I'll repeat the questions. Yeah, it's almost done. All right, I'll try not to wander away from the microphone as well. This is about the CRA and how it affects us as developers. Not us as companies, not us as corporations, not us as a consultant, a little bit. And I am one of the people that's on the CRA expert group, and that's a bunch of people that are chosen to help shape the standards and the result of how the CRA is going to be implemented. It's an EU regulation. I'll talk a little bit more about that. I'm not the only person on the CRA expert group. There's maybe 100 people. I'm the only person from Linux there, unfortunately. We have another person that's helping out through OpenSSF as well. Apache's there, Eclipse is there, and then all the governments are there, of course. So there's very little open source involvement in the CRA, but the people that created the CRA are very interested in making sure that open source works properly, which is very good. So they want to make sure they don't do anything that's going to keep people from using open source in Europe. So again, my own opinion though, don't use this to make any business decisions. There's lots of three-letter acronyms in the CRA. CRA itself, Cyber Resilience Act. The most important one you're going to see a lot of is PDE. That means those are things that are covered by the CRA. These are software in a device or software on its own. Think of it that way. The CRA covers things in the European Union market that contain software. That's about it. Before, they never have. There hasn't been any laws about that. The US has some rules about that as well. If you're selling to the US government, they're thinking of doing much the same thing that the CRA is doing in Europe for companies as well. So the CRA, think of it as something that Europe is doing first, but everybody else is going to do anyway. So if you can comply with the CRA here, you'll be fine. Of course, open source software, OSS. Software bill of materials is very important. SBOMs and the European Union. Just some people in Europe and the US don't know that's what the EU means. Basically, what is it? So again, software that's in a device or software that's being used in something. It's an obligation for basically everybody who is around that software, particularly manufacturers, distributors, importers, producers of software in the European Union or software that's used in the European Union. So it affects people in the US and affects people in Japan and India as well as that, companies that are involved in that. So it is worldwide that way. You can't just hold your nose and think it's not going to matter to you. It deals with product classifications, and different products are classified in different levels, and different products are determined, the rules are different for depending on the product type. I'll get into that a little bit. We don't have to worry about that much. The good and bad thing about open source software is we don't dictate use. So the good thing is we can't be liable for any use, but the bad thing is it can be used in any sort of way, including critical infrastructure or not critical infrastructure. So usually the critical rules will apply to us. I'll talk about that. And the last thing, they use this term called market surveillance and enforcement. It sounds really ominous. This is just the people that are going around and working and trying to enforce the law, and they're dealing with the security issues about that. It's just them watching that all the people and all the companies are working properly in the EU. And this is, they have this today for like paint regulations and plastic regulations and fittings for plumbing. This is not an unusual thing. Just now this is going to apply to software, which is good. So again, about the market surveillance, there's different groups that are going to be involved with that for us. CSERTs are interesting. All the different countries in the EU have a CSERT. These are groups that are having to deal with the cybersecurity issues of that country. Some countries have more than others, and it doesn't seem dictated by size. Germany has one. The Netherlands, which I'm a resident of, has 3. France, I think, has 2. There's going to be some shake-up and try unification of these, but there's a bunch of different groups all trying to manage this type of thing, and they kind of overlap in some, and they kind of don't overlap in some. But they might end up contacting you, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But there's one big group, ENISA, big, they're not very large in size, they are going to be the ones that are responsible for all of it. And they just announced yesterday that they are now part of the CVE and MITRE organization, so they are going to be responsible for handling the overseement of all of this. And that's good. So they'll hopefully keep the CSRTs in line, and they will be the unifying body. We don't want to have to deal with lots of different individual groups. You don't want to have to notify all 12 or 24 different countries. You want to be able to notify one. Again, CRAs are going to talk about the security aspects of software. And it's going to talk about how it's developed and how it's maintained and how it's created. And for most of that stuff, it doesn't matter to us. It's going to deal with for companies and what they have to basically report. It's much like an old ISO standard where you have to document what you're going to do and do what you documented. That's about it. So documenting what you do and how you got the software and what you're going to do with it is about all you need to do if you're a company. And it's going to handle the vulnerability reporting. And that's very important for us because we will report vulnerabilities, and vulnerabilities will be reported to us as software people. And along those lines, it's also going to dictate a bunch of standards. And the standards are going to deal with all this stuff. They're dealing with risk management right now, design, development, documentation, and production. The fun thing about these standards are they're not finished. They're not going to be finished until after the CRA is done. And they're advisory standards. It's encouraged for you to follow them, but it's not required at this point in time. And that's going to be interesting to see how those shake out. I'm trying to get involved in the standards process. It is a semi-closed process, which is really interesting when you're dealing with open source software, but we're working through that and they want us to participate and we're getting involved. If anybody wants to help me out there, please let me know. I don't want to be the only one involved there. So again, that's going to happen, but again, for us, not that matter much. And then I talked about types of products. Default is these are like most severe to less severe. Default is all software. Level 1 deals with some specific use cases. There's a big table in the document in the CRA. Level 2 is some more serious things like routers and whatnot, and it's critical is like hypervisors and some other types of stuff, microcode. The fun thing about Linux, it's all of those. Fun thing about all open source, it's all of those. So it dictates use. How the software is being used is to dictate what type of regulation. So for us, just think about everything for critical is going to be covering for us. It's not really a big deal, but it's kind of interesting in that the people creating the standards didn't realize that. They're like, oh, we don't have to worry about Linux because it can't be used as a hypervisor, right? Linux is a hypervisor. It can't be used as a bootloader, right? Oh, Linux is a bootloader. Fun things like that. Can't be used as yeah, it's microcode. So open source is everywhere, so don't worry about that. But don't worry about a lot of things. A lot of things got excluded. Services, software as a service, websites, not an issue. Again, open source is in a lot of these other things like automotive, medical, marines, a lot of electrical engineering stuff for like turbines and power plants. Linux and open source is in those, but it's not covered under the CRA. Supposedly it's covered under the rules for those different types of things, like automotive has some very strict rules in the European Union, but doesn't matter for us. And the fun thing is, non-commercial hobby products don't matter. And you're like, great, open source, it's my hobby. Doesn't matter. Until somebody uses it. This is the big sticking point. We can't dictate use, so we can't tell somebody not to use it. And so it's up to other people's actions will cause something to affect us as a developer. And it's not that fair, in a way, but in a way, we want our software to be used, right? So the creators of the CRA was like, realized this, and a lot of the drafting problems, they were going to impose some pretty stringent rules on us just by virtue of us producing open source software. So they backed it down, and they made it so it's easier for us, and hopefully it all makes a little more sense. So along those lines, there's different classifications of groups of software producers. Developers, it's just anybody, one of us. Stewards, and developers pretty much have no responsibility. All is good. You don't have to worry about things. Stewards do have to worry about a little bit, and that pretty much covers maybe a third of the people here. Manufacturers, integrators, and distributors are all commercial activities. That's companies, and there's lots of strict requirements for them, and there's lots of stuff. But us, as individual open source contributors, don't worry about those bottom three things at all. Which is great. If you run a consulting company, you kind of have to worry about a little bit about the manufacturers. It's not going to be a big deal. The manufacturer of the device has to do a lot of stuff. You'll just have to give them a bunch of documentation. So the OSS developers, not a problem. Stewards, a little bit of a problem. And the EU made this handy flowchart. It actually has their stamp on it, so we can rely on it. They presented this at FOSDEM, I think, a year and a half ago. So the fun thing is, if you're just contributing open source, not an issue, you're a developer. If you're doing a commercial activity, like you get paid for it, like most of us hopefully get paid, no, you're not an issue. So if you're not getting paid for something, not really a problem. If you are getting paid and you're directly making money, that's like a consultant, then you are a manufacturer and some rules apply, consultants in the middle. Legal person responsible for it for commercial activities, no, but if you are, then you're an open source steward. So I'll use two examples for me. I am the manager of the USB utils, or maintainer. USB utils is LSUSB and some other things for dealing with USB devices. I am not commercial, directly monetizing it, no, but I kind of get paid. I don't get paid for my day job, so I'm not in scope, not a big deal. Linux kernel, I can drop down to the bottom one. There's only two legal persons that are responsible for that, and that's me and Linus, unintentionally. So we are the open source software steward for Linux. So that means nobody else has to worry about that, which is nice, unless you're Yocto, a maintainer of Yocto. So then Richard Purdy has to worry about that. He's the open source steward. If you manage a nice software package that you actually get paid for it as part of your day job, then maybe you would be the steward. But for Linux, you don't have to worry too much about it. Zephyr, same issue. There's some people at the Linux Foundation who are responsible for distributing Zephyr. They are the open source software steward. You contribute to Zephyr, even as a paid job. You're not the steward. You're just a developer. Boom. You don't have to do that. So it cuts down this thing. So the open source software steward's a very bounded thing. What's good? So the majority of people, not in scope. Everybody can breathe a sigh of relief, right? But if you are a steward, you do have to do some things. And I have to do some things, and a few other people have to do some things. But it's not much. That's all you have to do. It makes it pretty simple. And we have some documentation on what's required here. You just have to provide a contact. So you need a security file, .txt, how people can get a hold of you if they find a problem. Part of the CRA is going to require manufacturers to report vulnerabilities that they find. They have to report it to you, the creator of the software, and they have to report it to the EU through ENISA. They just need a way to contact you. And you don't have to fix the problem, they just have to contact you. They can provide a fix if they want, but you don't have to take the fix. It's fine. They just have to be able to contact you and say, you can say, yeah, it's an issue, no, it isn't an issue. They have some pretty strict requirements. If they know something's broken and being taken advantage of, they have 72 hours in which to provide a fix or a report for it, but you don't have to. You can just take it, you're okay with it. And you have to, but if you do fix something security related, you have to report it. And this is what you should be doing today. You should be sending it off to Mitra to get a CVE, send it to GitHub, Red Hat, send it to kernel.org, I can get you a CVE. That's it. Report the problems, and away you go. So again, these are things, if you're a good engineer and managing a software project, you should be doing anyway. We have the tools for this. Make a security.txt file or MD file. Become a CNA. The CVE group makes it very easy to become a CNA and open and assign your own CVEs on their own. If not, you can assign one, get one from GitHub, like within click a little form if you have an open source project that happens to be hosted on GitHub. Red Hat will give you a CVE. They're becoming a root. Mitra, in the last resort, there's a web page that you can click to and say, give me a CVE, and they will. Bestpractices.dev. So this is the badging process that the OpenSSF has done for a long time. This lists all the good things for security, that's security related for open source projects should be following. I think if you meet the lowest level of what they classify, you meet the CRA. So these are things you should be doing already. And there's a really cool tool called Reuse from the FSFE. If you run reuse lint, it'll check that your licenses are properly documented and that your copyright is properly listed. Run those. You should be running those today. It also generates an SBOM automatically and add that to your package. USB utils has been doing it for a long time. It's really simple. We have these tools today. So you can make those changes to your project today and boom, as a steward, you're compliant with the CRA. It's not that hard. Anybody object to that? Anybody worried? This is too easy, guys. All right. Oh, and we have a checklist. I'll give you guys the presentation, but OpenSSF has a ton of documentation. If you're a manager, all these different categories, here's a checklist. It goes through the whole CRA and says, if you're a steward, here's the parts that are applicable to you, and here's what you have to do. But again, it boils down to those two things. Have a way to report bugs to you and report security issues out. That's it. It worked out to be very nice. So you can, it points to the real lines in the law, points out where everything goes, and it's not that hard. So we shouldn't really be scared, hopefully. Questions? Yes?
Check.
So
Check.
on the previous slide.
This one?
The previous one, sorry. No, the EU, yeah.
This guy.
This one. It says that it's providing support for first intended, like for commercial activities. Who's intended that? Is that, like, for example, I know that I'm not sure Linux or you ever expressed the intent of Linux being a commercial product.
We didn't. Nobody did. So that's the fun thing. That's where things get interesting. Intended for commercial activities means, so us as open source developers put software onto the market by releasing it as open source. And by doing that, we didn't dictate use that said you can't use it for commercial activity. So by implicit granting, we just allowed you to do it for commercial activity. Isn't fun. I know we didn't explicitly say use it, and our open source licenses do not dictate use. So it means it can be commercial activity. So that's the weird thing. So yeah, it's a workaround. And if you look at the interesting things they had beforehand, it was even much worse. The real reason they're doing this is they did not want some very large open source projects to not come under scope. So they were worried that, oh, if a company just dumps everything as open source, then they can disclaim all responsibility. And that's not a good idea. So I'll point out Android. Android company produces it, makes it open source, then they would not be, Google would not be held liable for anything in Android. That's not a good idea, right? Firefox, same idea. Chrome.
It's working now? Good. So I was at a very interesting conference in Berlin for Backstage, and CRA was a huge topic there. And there we came to the conclusion there's also an indirect affection for open source stewards, which is not so much legally, but I've spoke to a lot of companies who have now an increased interest in participating with open source software, even also in like becoming part maintainers or whatever. And so there could be a conflict. If it's for you a hobbyist project, now you have to deal with people for them. It's a commercial activity using this software. So on the one hand, we could have like maybe more companies like taking responsibility for open source software, which is a really good thing. I kind of liked of that outcome. But on the other hand, we might have the conflict of, for me it's hobbyist, for them it's a commercial activity. So
yes,
there could be a problem.
It could be a problem. So as a manufacturer, if you use open source software and you find a vulnerability or an issue, you have to report it to the steward or the project. So they have to report it to you. So they are going to have to come and talk to us. And companies that are smart realize it's better to be part of the development community in the first place to make it easier, yada, yada, yada. So they're going to actually join our communities and do that. But if they're not the maintainer or the people who push the release button, then they're not the steward. But it doesn't absolve them of the responsibility of a manufacturer. It just should make their contributions and more involvement in our stuff better. I think the CRA is good because they're going to now be involved. The other good thing about CRA, and I didn't really talk about this much for manufacturers, they have to now tell the world what software they use. It's required. So there's going to be all these things like, oh, wow, look at all this open source software. Linux really is in everything. Zephyr is in everything else. I mean, that's good for us. And so that's going to show the world that, oh, this is everywhere. And they are going to be contacting us. They have to provide a way to contact us. So we're going to start getting a lot more emails eventually. I'll talk about the timeline in a minute. But yeah, then they're going to want to join us, and they're going to want to do this. It makes their lives easier. They know if they work upstream, it's faster and cheaper, right? So they're going to have to, if their huge out-of-tree patch sets have vulnerabilities, they're going to have to fix them on their own. Now, if they're part of the main project, maybe they can get some help from us. We're not required to help them, but if we're nice, we sometimes can. But yeah, it's going to drive more use into us, which is good. All right, I got some more. Timelines. So it went into force. It's called entered into force in December. The next deadline is June of next year. All the governments are going to be ready, and the assessment body is ready. And this is like, so the reporting stuff for vulnerabilities is going to be ready. The governments are going to be standard. Some of the standards are going to be almost ready. Again, I said the standards are not going to be finished by the time this is all done. So we don't have, as an open source steward, these deadlines don't matter to us yet. Not an issue. If you're a manufacturer, September 11th, 2026 is the big date. Then you have to start reporting, and you have to start voluntarily reporting. The enforcement is not going to kick in until the end of December of next year, or middle of December next year, and then that's when everything applies. And that's when us as an open source steward actually applies. That's the only thing we need to worry about. You have until 2027, the end of it, to get your security.txt file in your repo. That's about it. It's not that much work for us. So that's when you're going to start seeing responsibilities for us as far as that goes. And that's when us, if you have a fix for a security issue that you know is a known security issue, you do have to report it to CVE or Mitra or NISA or somebody. They're going to come up with a standard group that you report to. Hopefully it's 1 in the world and not 20 in the world. We're working on that. The standards are going to be made. And again, they're voluntary, which is interesting. I don't know how that's going to work out. They're still being hashed out. It's a long, drawn-out process if anybody's ever worked with standards before. It's like the worst website you've ever seen. And everything goes around as Word documents on a website. All you get is a link to an updated Word document. Some of these aren't going to be finished until December. There's some continuing meetings of the expert group. I have another meeting in a couple weeks in Brussels. If you have anything that's worrying you, talk to me and I can bring it up there. So far for open source with the stewards, it looks pretty sane. We're going to hash things out with the standards. A lot of standards are going to be about risk-based and risk management. So it's going to be if you're making a device that happens to fit into that type of category, here's the risks that are involved and that you should take into effect when you're creating your device. Don't have all open ports. Don't have a no password as root. Things like that. Those are standards that we don't need to worry about so much as manufacturers need to worry about when creating a device. Yes, Kevin.
Is there some phase that they're in discussion of actually enforcement? Because so far it's just disclosure and reporting. Are they even talking about at some point having some sort of enforcement or some sort of policy?
So there is enforcement, as not with necessarily the standards, but there's enforcement of the policies as of December of 2027.
But that just means it's enforcement that you have to disclose something. It's not that you, I mean like actually having to fix the problems. That's what I mean.
So one of the rules, so a manufacturer, if they get a known vulnerability that they know is being exploited, they have 72 hours to report it, and I think X number of days before they have to fix it. There is some very, so if you're a manufacturer, there are some set rules in there. And there is, who's going to do the enforcement? I don't know. A lot of the way the EU works is self-reporting. And you have to, like for a CE mark, you have to self-report and you go through a third party to get your CE mark and you go on for that. It's going to work much that same way. Either you're going to be dumping all these SBOMs on this website somewhere. And then if some company, if one of the regulatory agencies come to you, you have to be able to produce them type stuff. So that's the enforcement. I don't know how that is going to happen. Sorry?
From my understanding, each country is expected to name an organism that will be doing the enforcing in that country.
Okay, all right, good.
What are the penalties if someone does complain with that? If a steward, for example,
If you're a steward and you don't have these two things,
yeah, I mean, if you forget, for example.
I don't know.
Okay.
0, supposedly. It's
Bad
zero.
karma.
Bad karma. Yeah, I think it's going to come down to the fact then a manufacturer might not use your software in their product. But, which, yeah, I know, I'm not going to claim that. I think enforcement stuff is coming later, right? I think they're talking about what to do later. It's interesting. Think of this as, I always use the analogy, and they tell me not to use it anymore, as a paint standards. You can't have paint that's harmful to children on a children's toy, right? Same type of thing, but who's going to enforce that? Somebody eventually will go around and suing you because you didn't comply with the compliances. But then you have to show problems, et cetera, et cetera. If we create software that is openly insecure and they use it in an openly insecure way, it's the manufacturer who uses it in an openly insecure way, it's not necessarily ours. Again, our responsibility was they could tell us about the bug, we don't have to fix the bug, which is nice. Originally, we were like going to have to fix it within 72 hours until somebody said that's against EU employment laws. So things like that. It's nice. So. All right. Cool.
You use the word legal person. I'm just curious what the definition of that is.
This is a term that the EU is defines, and there is a legal entity or person definition in the EU, and that's their rule, and I don't know what the definition is. So as an individual, I am a legal person. As a company, I'm not a legal person. I don't quite know. There's some rules there. They use that terminology very specifically, and for us, just think of it as the person responsible.
Thanks.
Pushing the release button. There's a ton of resources out there, Linux Foundation, there's a CRA site with a bunch of documents. There's a free CRA training course by David Willer that I cribbed a lot of this stuff from. OpenSSF has a ton. OpenSSF has been involved in the standardized committees. They've been involved in the creation of the law and working through that and paying, not necessarily a lobbying group, but paying a group that's paying attention to it for open source stuff, and that's continuing to happen. The Linux Foundation funds the OpenSSF as well, and they're now, I think there's going to be a full-time person in Brussels working on that, because there's other things coming down that are affecting open source besides the CRA. ANISA has some documentation on how things match up to what type of product and what type of requirements it's good, and there's a ton of documentation. But OpenSSF is the best one. The Linux Foundation stuff is good. If you are a manufacturer or a producer, take the free training course. There's a bunch of slides on what your requirements or your responsibilities are. So if you are a consulting company that sells services to other companies, you are going to be covered and have some other requirements. Take that and look at that. And again, OpenSSF has documented a bunch of that as well. So you will have to provide SBOMs and some things like that. But you get to charge for that, so it's good. Some company, I remember famously, one very, very large German company came up to me and said, we can't tell our engineers what software to use, so we can't produce an SBOM. And I said, that's a bigger problem for your engineering effort than it is for the law. You need to fix that first. Just ship an SBOM of what you're actually in a device. So it shouldn't be that hard. We have tools. We're getting better tools. Yocto has a tool. It'll spit out an SBOM. Zephyr has a tool. Linux kernel does not have a tool. The lawyers have been yelling at me for that for years. Hopefully they'll pay a consultant to do the work. It would be nice when you do a build of the kernel to actually list just the files that are applicable to that build. That's what you want for an SBOM. We have the tools almost there. We'll get them by December of 2027. So you can spit that into your thing in a standard format and away it goes. So that's cool. So you shouldn't be afraid. It shouldn't affect you that much. And put a security.txt in your thing. And that's it. Okay. Thank you.
Any more questions? If not, I have one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just a comment. So Sony's actually done some work on instrumenting GCC to record all items for SBOM work. So maybe there's some low-hanging fruit there to get something for the kernel.
So I did. I worked with Red Hat about 1.5 years ago to try and do that because Red Hat needs to start producing SBOMs when they build their distro. CMake provides this information, which is what Yocto and Zephyr use to get this information out. I've done some work with GCC and some tracing toolkits to try and get better information. Hopefully, the SBOM tools work really well for non-C-based programs right now, but the world still builds C code, so hopefully the GCC stuff will work. In the kernel, we actually do produce the information, it's just in a weird way, because we have our dependencies, right? They are in there. Hopefully GCC stuff, it'll happen. It just needs somebody to sit down and do the work. We have all these bits and pieces. Android has a tool that they use to determine what is and isn't in their builds already. So in their kernel builds, they spit out some build files. So it's there, just need to piece it together.
So I have one more. There's looking at our list of sponsors and knowing how many people in this room actually work for consultancies. This question's kind of along the lines of distinction between consultancies that are actually helping other people make products where we're not necessarily a manufacturer, but we're in that chain. Can you say a little bit more about that distinction between the actual manufacturer versus the consultancies that are helping them manufacture?
You are not the manufacturer of the device because you didn't put the device on the market.
Right.
So your requirements are much less. Now, the manufacturer's requirements are high, so they might task you with doing that work, which is great. A lot of it's just going to be SBOM, or reporting of vulnerabilities or fixing the vulnerabilities. So that's something you guys can write into your contracts because that's something that they have to do, and they have to abide by these laws, which is good. So you guys might get a little more work of this type of stuff. And I think that's a good idea. It's just good, solid engineering practices that these people should be following when they put a device on the market anyway. And part of the requirements is the software has to be updatable. That's something that you're going to have to design into all your products finally, which is good. And provide the tool and provide the infrastructure to update it. Mario behind you.
One more question. What do you recommend to do with dead projects? I mean, let's suppose we do something in the past, 10, 12 years ago. It is dead. We already replaced it by another tool, so we don't want to add anything there, to have any kind of effort mundane, because it's dead. What should we do with those things?
So if you are a software developer and you released a product 10 years ago and you're not maintaining it anymore, you don't have to do anything because you're not responsible. You can put up a security.txt file if you wanted to, but they can report things to you, but you don't have to do anything. Because you're not maintaining it. You're not doing a release. You are not an open source steward anymore because you're not doing releases anymore. It's gone. Now,
Okay.
the manufacturer who takes that dead product is now they're the ones responsible for making sure that it's secure and abides by all the rules. Those requirements are not pushed onto you. Again, as an open source steward, if you're not being the one that's doing any work on this thing, then you're not a steward. So you're okay. Now, hopefully they don't take that 10-year-old dead product, but we know they do.
Yeah, we know.
But then that's their responsibility as far as that goes. So liveliness of, is a product actually abiding by these, is probably going to be part of that SBOM. There's 2 questions down here. No, not one over there. Nope.
Yeah, so the previous question was on ancient software, but what if there's something that a project that basically stops being useful, and there are no new releases? What are the responsibilities on those? For instance, obsolete software.
Obsolete software. So the fun part is, if you're not doing any releases anymore, you're not responsible for it anymore. You don't have to do the reporting. So the manufacturer is the one that has to report the vulnerabilities. So they can report the vulnerabilities just like today. I mean, Mitra will issue a CV for anything, right? And probably too much. But they are the ones responsible. You can have a whole bunch of look at old repos for old libraries. They'll just start issuing vulnerabilities and they'll not be fixed. There's no responsibility for you to fix anything. It's responsibility for the manufacturer who's using the software to have a fix. They are the ones who took your software. They're the ones who have to do the fix. You don't have to do the fix. So you're done. If you're not doing a release anymore and you're not one responsible for doing that release in that bottom corner, you have no responsibilities anymore. So you're okay.
This probably stems from other talks I think I've seen you give, but do we have to classify whether something is a fix or not a fix?
So the joy of open source software is we can't dictate use. So I don't know if a vulnerability or a bug is a vulnerability or not. So me as an open source software at the kernel level has to classify anything that meets the standard of what a vulnerability could be as a vulnerability. It's up to you as an integrator and a manufacturer to determine if that vulnerability is applicable to you or not. And that's it. So open source software, we're pounding it through the CVEs people, and they kind of understand, like look at us and curl. We both don't dictate use, we're used everywhere, and any bug there could be a problem or could not be a problem. So you can't declare this is a severe vulnerability versus this isn't a severe vulnerability. So we have to report everything. And CVE and the classic classification ones don't like that model. And now the EU realizes this, because I've drilled this into them, and as far as the risk management goes, it is going to come down to a case-by-case basis for this type of device, how it works. Not up to us. So if somebody reports a vulnerability that they're using your software in this really weird way, you can say, yeah, that was a vulnerability, wonderful, and that's great. But again, you're not responsible for fixing it. But if you fix something that you think is a vulnerability, you are responsible for just reporting that as a fix. Okay. So that's an additional impact. But we kind of should be doing that anyway, I'd argue, because you don't want other people to be doing that for you.
Thank you. I used to think of SBOMs as like, it has Linux kernel version 6.10.25 or something, and that's it. But you are saying you need to have your SBOM on the granularity of files?
That's going to come down to the standards, and I do not know what the rules are going to be for that. I think they should be at the granularity of the files, because we have the tools to do that. If you look at what Yocto and Zephyr can spit out, it gives you that today, so why not just use it? It's going to be some gigantic reporting problem. Because we all know that if you take Linux version 6.6.6, they change it, right? It's little modifications, little tweaks, so the hash would be different from the hash released from kernel.org when you look on the SBOM. So it'd be nice to see that this wasn't the same one that kernel.org had, right? So I would say file level granularity is a good idea. I don't know what the standards are going to come back as, whether it's higher level or low.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Yocto dude here. That's why I had to chip in. The reason is that in many cases, you're not shipping a standard kernel configuration. I mean, if you're running Debian, whatever, then chances that you're running the same kernel as your buddy next door are extremely high. If you're doing Yocto, then chances that you are the only one who's building that exact kernel configurations are extremely high. So you really want to know which files, with which configuration went into your build to retroactively actually understand if a vulnerability affects you or not. Example, if you're not shipping any modules for networking protocols or whatever, then you don't care about vulnerabilities being reported, not as the manufacturer. Yeah. And that's why I want them. So it's in the best interest of the manufacturer to actually have the highest possible granularity of the SBOMs. And you said it's a huge reporting problem. Yes, I can tell you it's a 4 gigabyte huge reporting problem for one SBOM.
Yeah, that's fine. That's just storage. But and the good thing is, I mean, we want that type of information out there. When we report vulnerabilities for Linux kernel, I give you a file that are affected. I can't do a configuration that's affected. People wanted to do that. We might be able to give you that. But files that are affected, and that just weeds out tons and tons of vulnerabilities from your SBOM instantly. That's a good way to sort it. So if you are releasing bugs or CVEs to the world, at least provide the file information. This JSON records are there to give you that. Use them.
Greg, when we are, for example, working as a packager on Fedora, Debian, or whatever, if we don't pick something security issue, or what happens? Are there any penalties? Are you still Steward, or are we manufacturer in this case? How that works?
So if you're a packager for Fedora, you're not the steward. The people who release the Fedora release are the stewards.
Okay.
Right, so the Debian release managers are the stewards. It's kind of tricky and it's messy, but that's why, like, me and Linus are the stewards. We're like, what? I didn't want that. But it's better than the alternatives that they came up with, so we'll deal with that. Like, who's the Zephyr release manager these days? Does it rotate around? Anyway, they're going to be the steward.
What is the process for abandoning software? Let's say you make a version today, you add your security.txt, and you want to abandon that piece of software. You keep getting reports of vulnerabilities. You still have to report those vulnerabilities even if you abandon that software?
So if somebody reports a vulnerability to you under the CRA, they will also report it to ANISA. So you don't have to report it again. So you can just let them be, and you can ignore it or contest it or whatever.
If a user reports a vulnerability, they also have to report it to NISA?
So as part of the rules, as a manufacturer, if they find a vulnerability, they have to report to ANISA as well. Yes.
But a user also?
User, no.
But if I get reports from a user and I abandon that piece of software, what happens?
No, well, is the user a manufacturer? No. They have no, yeah, that's not an issue. Users don't come into play with the CRA, unfortunately.
So I can abandon software and I don't do anything else. Once
You can abandon the software all you want. Yeah, if you're abandoning it and not doing it, that's fine. Abandoned software is an interesting question, whether you create a CVE saying this is abandoned or not. Mitra and those people are trying to realize that we need to have a way to mark things as abandoned and to know that. They just released some new rules today about how you should not create a CVE for that, but they are going to come up with something. So there will be a way for people to automatically tell this is abandoned or it's not in a machine-readable format. So if you abandon it, if somebody notices it's abandoned, they could probably push to ANISA, hey, this is abandoned, you're not going to object to that. They're on their own. So, yeah. It might be good. It'd be interesting to see what software that we all rely on that actually is abandoned.
On the subject of abandoned, can you abandon old releases of something?
Oh, yes. We can say a newer release succeeds that. Anyway, yeah. Use a newer release. We can say, don't use that old one, use a new one.
Okay, so we have an official way to say that now.
No, well.
We will have a way.
Yes. I'm running out of time. I think one more question.
Anna.
Here, I was worried there wouldn't be a question.
Is there a difference between active development and an actual release? So, for example, you can actively develop a software without doing a release because it's not ready for use in other contexts, or you just want to use it as a hobby project?
Yeah, that's fine. Now, if you did a release and you're still working on it, you are the steward.
Yeah, but is there a really clear difference between active development and what is defined as a release?
I don't think so, no. Again, throw your security.txt out there and you're good.
Okay.
These are things you should be doing anyway. There's no reason that any software project should not be following it as best practices. If you don't have it, I can't see why you wouldn't be doing the same way. But thank you very much.
Thanks, Greg.